The year 1890 was still young when the city of Louisville, Kentucky, found itself standing on the edge of a catastrophe so sudden and so violent that it would forever change the way people thought about the skies above the Ohio River Valley. It was the 27th day of March, a Thursday, and the afternoon had been deceptively mild. The air had that heavy, expectant stillness that often precedes a spring storm, but nobody paid it much mind. Louisville was a bustling, growing city of nearly 200,000 souls, proud of its industry, its river trade, and its grand new buildings. The Southern Exposition had just closed a few years earlier, leaving behind a legacy of electric lights and a sense of progress. People were busy with their daily lives. Merchants selling dry goods, factory workers finishing their shifts, children playing in the streets, and families preparing for supper. No one could have predicted that within a few hours, the very fabric of their world would be torn apart by a force of nature that seemed almost biblical in its fury. The storm began as so many do, with dark clouds gathering on the western horizon just after 4 in the afternoon. Witnesses later described the sky turning a sickly greenish yellow, the kind of color that old farmers said meant trouble. The wind picked up first in gusts, then in steady, howling blasts. Rain began to fall not gently but in sheets that stung the skin. Then came the hail. Stones as large as hens' eggs pounded the rooftops, shattering windows and driving pedestrians to seek cover under awnings and in doorways. The thunder was constant, a low rumbling that grew into a deep, grinding roar unlike anything those who heard it had ever experienced. Some said it sounded like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on the city at once. And then, with terrifying suddenness, the tornado was upon them. The funnel cloud touched down near the western edge of the city, just across the Ohio River in what was then known as the Portland neighborhood. It moved with an almost intelligent malevolence, skipping and dipping, then settling into a straight line of destruction that carved a path through the heart of Louisville. The tornado was not exceptionally wide, perhaps only 400 yards across at its worst, but it was incredibly violent. Modern meteorologists, looking at the damage descriptions from that day, estimate it was at least an F4 on the Fujita scale, meaning winds well over 200 miles per hour. But in 1890 there was no scale. There was only the raw, terrifying experience of a wind that lifted entire houses off their foundations and smashed them into splinters. Trees were uprooted and thrown like matchsticks. Streetcars were toppled from their tracks. Iron bridges were twisted into grotesque shapes. Churches lost their steeples, factories lost their roofs, and the city's gas lines were ruptured, sending flames licking into the night. In the space of perhaps 20 minutes, the tornado tore a 3-mile-long gash through the city. It crossed the downtown area, hitting the business district with particular viciousness. The corner of 9th and Main Streets was annihilated. The Germania building, a 4-story brick structure, collapsed like a house of cards, burying dozens of people beneath tons of rubble. The nearby Park Hotel, a landmark of the city, had its entire front facade ripped away, exposing the rooms inside like a dollhouse. Guests and staff were thrown about, some killed instantly, others pinned under fallen beams. The screams of the injured and the trapped rose above the howling wind, but there was no one to help them until the storm passed. And even then, the danger was not over. Fires broke out all over the city, fueled by broken gas mains and overturned stoves. In some places, the flames spread faster than the rescue workers could stop them. The tornado had already done so much damage that the fire department found its access blocked by mountains of debris. One of the most tragic stories to come out of that day was the destruction of the Falls City Brewery. The brewery was a massive complex of stone and brick built to last, but the tornado tore through it as if it were made of paper. The enormous vats of beer, some holding thousands of gallons, were shattered, sending rivers of ale flowing through the streets. Workers who had been inside the building were buried alive. It took days to recover all the bodies. Among the dead was a man named John O'Brien, a father of 4 who had just started his shift. His wife, hearing the news, collapsed in grief and had to be carried to a neighbor's house. The brewery itself never fully recovered, and its ruins stood as a grim monument to the storm for years afterward. But the tornado was no respecter of persons. It struck rich and poor alike. On Broadway, then a fashionable street lined with mansions, the storm tore the roofs off several grand homes. In one house, a young girl named Mary was playing piano when the wall behind her exploded inward. She was thrown through a window and into the garden, miraculously alive, though badly cut by glass. Her mother, who had been in the kitchen, was found dead beneath a collapsed chimney. In the tenement neighborhoods near the river, whole families were wiped out. The wooden row houses offered no protection. People were crushed, impaled by flying debris, or drowned in the sudden deluge of rain that followed the storm. Bodies were found scattered blocks from where they had been living. It was a scene of such complete devastation that seasoned policemen and firemen wept openly as they dug through the wreckage. When the tornado finally lifted and moved on, leaving a trail of destruction that stretched into Indiana, the survivors emerged from their hiding places to a world that had changed forever. The silence was the first thing many noticed. The wind had stopped, the rain had ceased, but the air was filled with the sounds of groaning metal, dripping water, and the cries of the injured. Dust hung in a thick brown cloud over the city. The sun, which had been hidden, now broke through the clouds, casting an eerie orange light on the ruins. People wandered through the streets in a daze, calling out the names of loved ones. Some found family members alive, hugging them and weeping with relief. Others found only silence. The immediate response was a mixture of chaos and heroism. Within minutes, the first volunteers began digging through the rubble with their bare hands. They were joined by neighbors, by off-duty firefighters, by anyone who could lift a beam or carry a bucket of water. Doctors set up makeshift hospitals in the few buildings that were still standing. Churches and schools were converted into morgues. The dead were laid out in rows, often unidentified, their faces covered with whatever cloth could be spared. The number of casualties grew by the hour. By the time the initial count was finished, over 100 people had been killed and more than 1,000 had been injured. Hundreds of homes and businesses were destroyed, and the property damage was estimated at several $1,000,000, a staggering sum for the time. Word of the disaster spread quickly by telegraph. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the terrible tornado in Louisville. Relief efforts began pouring in from other cities. The Red Cross, still a relatively young organization, sent supplies and volunteers. President Benjamin Harrison ordered the military to provide aid. But for the people of Louisville, the first night after the storm was a nightmare. With no electricity, no gas, and many water mains broken, they huddled in the darkness. Fires still smoldered here and there, casting flickering shadows. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, dust, and something worse, the sweet, sickly odor of death. Gangs of looters began to move through the ruined districts, taking advantage of the chaos. The police were overwhelmed, and vigilante groups formed to protect what was left. It was a time of fear and sorrow, but also of remarkable resilience. Among the stories of that night is that of a widow named Mrs. Catherine Walker who lived on Jackson Street. Her small house had been flattened. She had been trapped under a heavy beam, pinned but alive, for several hours. Her young son, barely 8 years old, had managed to crawl out and run for help. He found a neighbor, a strong man named Tom Ralston, who waded through the wreckage and lifted the beam off Mrs. Walker with a strength he never knew he had. She was carried to a makeshift hospital, where a doctor set her broken arm and stitched a gash on her scalp. She survived, and years later she would tell her grandchildren about the kindness of the man who saved her, and the way the whole neighborhood came together to help each other that terrible night. The tornado of 1890 left an indelible mark on Louisville. In its wake, the city rebuilt, but it also learned. Building codes were strengthened. New construction was required to be more robust. The city's fire and emergency services were expanded and better organized. And the people, those who lived through it, carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They would never again hear the sound of a distant rumble or feel the electric charge in the air before a storm without a shiver of fear. The Louisville tornado became a part of the city's identity, a shared tragedy that bound the community together even as it tore apart so many families. As we look back from more than a century later, it is important to remember that these were real people with real hopes and fears who faced an unimaginable disaster. They were not just statistics in a history book. They were mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, friends and strangers. Their stories deserve to be told. And so we will continue to explore what happened on that fateful day in March of 1890, how the city responded, and what lessons were learned. But for now, we leave the survivors in the darkness of that first night, with the fires still burning and the search for the living still underway. The morning would bring a new dawn, but it would not erase the devastation. It would only reveal the full extent of the tragedy and the long road ahead. The long road ahead began with the first gray light of dawn on March 28, 1890. As the sun rose over the shattered city, the full scope of the disaster became visible in a way that the darkness had mercifully hidden. The streets that had once been lined with stores, saloons, and homes were now nothing but rubble and splintered wood. The great iron bridge that connected Louisville to the Indiana shore had been twisted like a ribbon. The Ohio River, usually a source of commerce and beauty, was choked with debris, barges torn from their moorings, furniture, clothing, and even the bodies of animals and people. The water, too, had turned a murky brown, stained by mud and blood. The survivors emerged from the wreckage like ghosts, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Many had lost everything. Some had lost everyone. The first order of business was to find the living. Rescue workers, many of them volunteers who had been up all night, continued to dig through the piles of bricks and timber with their bare hands. They listened for cries, for moans, for any sign of life. Every so often, a shout would go up. Someone had been found alive. A child pulled from a cellar. A woman rescued from a collapsed stairwell. A man who had been trapped under a heavy beam for hours, his legs crushed but his spirit unbroken. Each rescue was a small victory, but the death toll continued to climb. The morgues were overwhelmed. The city's only official morgue was a small building, soon filled to overflowing. Bodies were laid out in the streets, covered with tarpaulins or blankets. The coroner and his assistants worked tirelessly trying to identify the dead. They used any means available: personal letters, jewelry, distinctive clothing. Some bodies were so badly mutilated that identification was impossible. They were buried in a mass grave at Cave Hill Cemetery, a tragic monument to the storm's indiscriminate fury. The city's newspapers printed lists of the dead and missing, and the streets were filled with people searching for loved ones, carrying photographs and descriptions, hoping against hope. Among the many heartbreaking stories of that morning was that of the Fischer family. Heinrich Fischer, a German immigrant, had owned a small grocery store on Market Street. The tornado had demolished the store and the apartment above it where he lived with his wife Anna and their 3 children. When the storm passed, Heinrich crawled out from under a collapsed shelf, his arm broken, his face covered in cuts. He called for Anna and the children. There was no answer. He dug frantically, tearing at the debris with his good arm until his fingernails bled. He found Anna first. She was dead, a large piece of masonry having crushed her skull. Then he found the body of his youngest, little Karl, only 2 years old, still clutching a toy soldier. The other 2 children were never found. Heinrich spent the next 3 days wandering the streets, calling their names. Finally, he collapsed from exhaustion and was taken to a hospital. He never fully recovered. He moved away from Louisville a year later, unable to bear the memories. The human toll was staggering, but the city had to move forward. The mayor, Charles D. Jacob, declared a state of emergency and established a relief committee. He ordered all able-bodied men to assist in the cleanup. Businesses that were still standing opened their doors to shelter the homeless. The city's breweries, those that had survived, donated beer and water. The railroads ran special trains, bringing in supplies from other cities. The telegraph lines hummed with requests for help, and help came. From Cincinnati, from Indianapolis, from Chicago, even as far as New York, trains loaded with food, clothing, medicine, and doctors arrived. The Red Cross, under the leadership of Clara Barton, set up a field hospital in the remains of the Galt House, the grand hotel that had been partially destroyed. They worked day and night, treating the injured, comforting the dying, but not all the help was welcome. Along with the relief workers came the reporters. The national press descended on Louisville, eager to cover the story. They interviewed survivors, took photographs of the devastation, and sent dramatic accounts back to their newspapers. Some of these reports were sensationalized, exaggerating the death toll or fabricating tales of heroism and villainy. The people of Louisville, still in shock, resented the intrusion. They wanted to grieve in peace, to rebuild without being gawked at. But the press was relentless. One reporter from the New York World even tried to bribe a gravedigger to let him photograph the mass grave. He was chased out of the cemetery by an angry mob. Meanwhile, the looters grew bolder. The police, already stretched thin, could not be everywhere. Gangs of thieves moved through the ruined districts, stripping bodies of jewelry, stealing from abandoned homes, and even ransacking the makeshift hospitals for drugs and supplies. The citizens had enough. Vigilante committees were formed. Men armed with shotguns and clubs patrolled the streets at night. They caught several looters and administered rough justice, beatings, and in at least one case a hanging. The mayor condemned the vigilante actions but was powerless to stop them. The city was on the edge of chaos, order hanging by a thread. Amidst the darkness, there were moments of profound humanity. A group of nuns from the Sisters of Charity opened a soup kitchen in the ruins of a church. They fed hundreds of people each day, never asking for payment, never turning anyone away. A young doctor named James O'Connell worked for 36 hours straight, performing surgeries by candlelight. He saved dozens of lives before collapsing from exhaustion. A blacksmith named Samuel Green, whose own shop had been destroyed, fashioned makeshift tools from salvaged metal to help clear debris. He worked for days without sleep, refusing to rest until he had helped dig out his neighbors. The tornado also brought out the best in the city's African American community, which was largely segregated and impoverished. In the years following the Civil War, Louisville had a significant black population, but they lived in the worst parts of the city, often in flimsy shacks that offered no protection from the storm. The tornado had devastated these neighborhoods, killing many and leaving hundreds homeless. Yet despite their own suffering, black churches and community organizations opened their doors to everyone, regardless of race. They set up shelters and distributed food. White survivors, many of whom had never set foot in a black church before, came seeking help and were welcomed. For a brief time, the color line blurred, united by shared tragedy, but the recovery was slow. Weeks turned into months. The city council passed a series of ordinances to regulate building construction. New buildings had to be made of brick or stone with stronger foundations. Roofs had to be anchored more securely. The city also invested in a new fire alarm system and expanded its fire department. The phone company, which had just begun laying lines, accelerated its work, recognizing the need for better communication during emergencies. And the U.S. Weather Service, which had been criticized for not warning the city, began to develop a more systematic approach to tornado forecasting. It would take years, but the study of severe weather eventually advanced because of tragedies like the Louisville Tornado. The emotional scars, however, took longer to heal. Survivors suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares. They flinched at the sound of thunder. They could not bear to be in confined spaces or near loud noises. Many turned to alcohol or religion to cope. Church attendance soared in the months after the storm. Revivals were held in the streets, preachers calling the tornado a punishment from God for the city's sins. Others rejected that notion outright, arguing that God did not cause such senseless destruction. The debate raged in newspapers and in homes, but no one had an answer. The tornado was a mystery, a force of nature that defied explanation. One of the most poignant symbols of the storm's legacy was the fate of the Falls City Brewery. Its ruins stood for years, a jagged reminder of the power of the wind. Eventually, the site was cleared and a new building erected, but the old brewery was never forgotten. In the 1920s, a new generation of Louisvillians would visit the spot and hear stories from their parents and grandparents about the day the beer ran in the streets. The story became a part of local folklore, a tale that would be told for generations. The tornado of 1890 also changed the way people thought about weather. Before the storm, many believed that tornadoes were rare in the Ohio Valley, that they were a phenomenon of the Great Plains. After Louisville, people realized that no place was safe. Tornadoes could strike anywhere at any time. This realization led to a greater interest in meteorology. The U.S. Weather Bureau, which had only been established a few years earlier, began to collect more data on tornadoes, studying their patterns and trying to develop warning systems. It was slow progress, but the seeds were sown. As the months passed, Louisville rebuilt. New buildings rose from the rubble, taller and stronger than before. The city's economy recovered, its population grew. Life returned to normal, if such a thing is possible, after a disaster. But the survivors never forgot. They held memorial services on the anniversary of the storm. They told their children and grandchildren about the day the sky turned black and the wind came screaming through the streets. They kept photographs of the wreckage in family albums. The tornado became a part of the city's collective memory, a defining moment that separated the time before from the time after. In the decades that followed, other tornadoes would strike other cities: St. Louis, Omaha, Waco, Joplin, each one a tragedy in its own right. But the Louisville Tornado of 1890 remains one of the deadliest and most devastating in American history. It killed at least 120 people, though some estimates put the number higher. It destroyed more than 1,000 buildings. It left a mark on the landscape and on the hearts of the people that could never be erased. Today, if you walk through downtown Louisville, you will see few traces of the storm. The buildings have been rebuilt many times over. The streets have been paved and repaved. The city has grown and changed. But if you know where to look, you can still find reminders. In Cave Hill Cemetery, a granite monument stands in the section where the unidentified dead were buried. It bears a simple inscription: in memory of the victims of the tornado of March 27, 1890. On certain days, you might see fresh flowers laid at its base. The memory endures. And so, as we close this chapter of the story, we turn our attention to the survivors and their journey. They faced an unimaginable catastrophe and emerged scarred but unbroken. They rebuilt their homes, their businesses, their lives. They honored the dead by living fully. And they passed on the lesson that even in the darkest moments there is light, the light of human kindness, of community, of resilience. That is the true legacy of the Louisville Tornado of 1890. In the years that followed, the memory of the tornado settled into the bones of the city, but it did not rest quietly. For every family that rebuilt, there was another that could not bear to stay. Some survivors packed what little they had left in boarded trains for Chicago, St. Louis, or Cincinnati, hoping to outrun the ghost of that furious sky. They left behind empty lots and half-finished foundations, grim monuments to the randomness of destruction. Yet those who remained found themselves bound together by something stronger than geography. They were bound by the shared act of survival. Among the survivors, the most haunted were the children. Little ones who had seen their parents crushed by falling walls, who had been pulled from debris clutching the hands of strangers, who had wandered the streets in a daze, calling for mothers and fathers who would never answer. In the weeks after the storm, a makeshift orphanage was established in a repurposed schoolhouse on the outskirts of the city. The nuns who ran it, the same sisters of charity who had fed the hungry, now took in dozens of children, many of them injured, all of them traumatized. They taught them to read and write, to pray, to bandage their own wounds. But the nuns were not trained for this kind of grief. They watched as children screamed themselves hoarse in the night, waking from nightmares of twisting black clouds. They held them and rocked them and whispered that the storm was over, that it would never come back. But the children knew better. They had learned that the world could change in an instant, that the ground beneath their feet was not solid, that the sky could fall. One such child was a girl named Maggie O'Rourke, who had lost both her parents and 3 siblings in the collapse of a tenement building near the Ohio River. She was 7 years old when the tornado struck. She was found wandering the ruins, clutching a single porcelain doll that had been crushed to pieces. She refused to let go of the doll, even after the nuns tried to pry it from her hands. She carried those shards with her for months, carefully wrapping them in a piece of cloth. When asked why, she said she was waiting for her mother to come and fix it. It took her years to understand that her mother was not coming back. Maggie grew up to become a teacher, and she never told her students about the storm. But she kept that doll wrapped in a drawer until the day she died. The economic impact of the tornado rippled far beyond the city limits. Insurance companies, many of them based in New York and Philadelphia, were hit hard by the claims. The total insured losses were estimated at nearly $3 million, a staggering sum in 1890. Some companies went bankrupt. Others raised their rates so high that many Louisvillians could no longer afford coverage. This, in turn, slowed the rebuilding process. Homeowners who had lost everything could not get loans without insurance. Banks were reluctant to lend money for construction in a neighborhood that had just been wiped off the map. The city government stepped in, offering low-interest loans and tax breaks to encourage rebuilding. But the bureaucracy moved slowly, and many families spent months living in tents or in the homes of relatives, waiting for their lives to be pieced back together. The tornado also reshaped the city's relationship with the Ohio River. Before the storm, Louisville had been a thriving river town, its economy dependent on the steamboats and barges that brought goods and passengers from up and down the Mississippi watershed. After the tornado, many businesses relocated to higher ground, away from the flood-prone lowlands where the worst damage had occurred. The riverfront, once the heart of the city, fell into decline. Warehouses stood empty, docks rotted, and the once bustling wharves grew quiet. It would take decades for Louisville to reclaim its connection to the river, and even then, the memory of the tornado's wrath lingered. Every time the wind picked up and the sky turned gray, riverboat captains looked to the horizon with unease. In the immediate aftermath, the city's infrastructure was tested to its limits. The waterworks, damaged by the storm, struggled to provide clean drinking water. Many residents resorted to boiling river water, which led to outbreaks of typhoid and cholera. The hospitals, already overwhelmed with the injured, now had to treat patients suffering from waterborne illnesses. The death toll from disease in the months following the tornado may have been as high as the number killed outright. It is a grim footnote that historians often overlook, but it underscores the brutal reality of 19th-century disaster response. The storm itself was only the beginning of the suffering. The railroad companies, too, faced a crisis. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad, a major employer in the city, had lost miles of track and several locomotives. The storm had ripped up rails, twisted them into knots, and scattered freight cars like toys. The railroad's management, based in a different city, initially hesitated to commit the resources needed for repairs. This infuriated the local workers and businessmen who depended on the railroad for their livelihoods. They held protests, demanding that the company do its part to rebuild the city. Eventually, the railroad relented, bringing in crews from as far away as Tennessee to restore the lines. Within 6 months, the trains were running again, but the bitterness lingered. The disaster had exposed the fault lines between corporate power and local need. Meanwhile, the debate over the cause of the tornado raged on. Some scientists argued that the storm was a meteorological anomaly, a freak confluence of warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and a cold front sweeping down from the Great Lakes. Others pointed to deforestation and urban sprawl, suggesting that the city itself had somehow attracted the storm. A few even speculated about the influence of electrical currents in the atmosphere or the alignment of the planets. None of these theories had much evidence to support them, but they reflected a desperate human need to find meaning in chaos. If the tornado had a cause, then perhaps it could be predicted, avoided, controlled. The alternative was too terrible to accept. That the world was random, that safety was an illusion. The U.S. Weather Bureau, still in its infancy, came under heavy criticism for failing to issue a warning. At the time, the Bureau had only a handful of observers stationed across the country, and their reports were transmitted by telegraph. On the morning of March 27, 1890, the observer in Louisville had noted the falling barometer and the unusual heat, but he had no way of knowing that a tornado was forming. The Bureau's director, a man named Mark Harrington, defended his staff, arguing that tornado prediction was impossible with the tools available. But the public was not satisfied. Newspapers across the country ran editorials calling for improved weather services. Congress, pressured by the tragedy, allocated additional funds for research. Within a decade, the Weather Bureau had established a network of storm spotters and developed rudimentary forecasting techniques. The Louisville Tornado was a catalyst for change, though the change came slowly. In the city itself, the political landscape shifted. The mayor who had led the initial recovery effort, a Democrat named Charles D. Jacob, was hailed as a hero for his calm and decisive leadership. He rode this wave of popularity to a second term, but his administration was plagued by accusations of corruption. Critics claimed that he had awarded rebuilding contracts to his political allies, that he had skimmed money from the relief funds. An investigation was launched, and though Mayor Jacob was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, the scandal tarnished his reputation. It was a bitter irony. The man who had guided the city through the storm was nearly destroyed by the politics of the aftermath. The vigilante committees that had formed to fight looters also left a complicated legacy. Some of their members were genuine heroes, ordinary citizens who had risked their lives to protect their neighbors. Others were little more than mobs, using the chaos as an excuse to settle old scores. They targeted immigrants, African Americans, and the poor, accusing them of crimes they had not committed. There were reports of beatings, of homes set on fire, of men dragged from their beds and lynched. The official death toll from vigilante violence is uncertain, but historians estimate that at least a dozen people were killed by these groups in the weeks after the tornado. The city's elite, fearful of anarchy, turned a blind eye. They were more concerned with restoring order than with justice. The African American community, which had suffered disproportionately in the storm, faced additional hardships. Many of the jobs that had been available before the tornado, such as dock work and domestic service, vanished with the destruction. Black workers were often the last to be hired for the rebuilding effort, and when they were hired, they were paid less than their white counterparts. The makeshift shelters that had been set up in black churches were gradually dismantled, their residents forced to find housing in a city that had little to offer. Segregation, which had been informal before the storm, hardened into law in the decades that followed. The brief moment of unity when black and white survivors had shared food and shelter faded into memory. The color line returned, sharper than ever, yet there were individuals who fought against this tide. One of them was a black minister named Reverend Henry Coleman, whose church had been destroyed by the tornado. He had lost his wife and 2 children in the storm. Instead of succumbing to despair, he led his congregation in building a new church brick by brick, using salvaged materials from the ruins. He also founded a school for black children, teaching them alongside white children in a defiant act of integration. He faced constant harassment, threats, vandalism, even an attempt on his life, but he refused to back down. He preached that the tornado had been a test from God, a trial meant to purify the city of its sins, and that the greatest sin was hatred. His sermons drew crowds of both races. For a time, his church was a beacon of hope in a divided city. The memory of the tornado also manifested in the arts. A local poet named Alice Carter wrote a long narrative poem titled The Wind's Reckoning, which was published in a Louisville newspaper and later circulated nationally. It described the storm in vivid, terrifying detail, from the first cool breeze to the final, deafening roar. The poem ended with a call for unity and resilience. It was recited at memorial services for years. A painter named John Whistler, a distant relative of the famous James McNeill Whistler, created a series of canvases depicting the aftermath. His most famous work, The Morning After, showed a mother cradling a child in the rubble, her face a mask of grief and determination. The painting toured the country and was eventually purchased by the Library of Congress. But the most enduring legacy of the tornado was the transformation of Louisville's built environment. The new building codes mandated that all structures be made of fire-resistant materials. Wooden buildings were gradually replaced with brick and stone. Roofs were required to have stronger ties to the walls. Windows were reinforced. The streets, which had been a chaotic tangle of narrow alleys and dead ends, were widened and straightened. The city began to look less like a frontier town and more like a modern metropolis. The skyline changed. The old, rickety buildings gave way to solid, permanent structures. The tornado had not only destroyed the city, it had forced it to reinvent itself. As the years passed, the survivors aged and the stories grew. The tornado became a legend, a tale passed down from parent to child, each telling adding new details, new horrors, new heroes. The beer that ran in the streets became a river of ale. The wind that lifted a train car became a gust that tossed a locomotive into the Ohio River. The number of dead fluctuated, growing from 100 to 200 to 500, depending on who was telling the story. The truth became layered with myth, and that perhaps was the only way to cope with such an event, to transform it into a story, to give it a shape and a meaning that the raw horror could never possess. In 1910, on the 20th anniversary of the storm, the city held a grand commemoration. Thousands of people gathered at the site of the former Falls City Brewery, where a memorial plaza had been constructed. Speeches were made, a choir sang, wreaths were laid. Among the attendees were children who had been born after the tornado, now young adults who had grown up hearing the stories. They listened politely, but the storm was not their memory. It belonged to their parents, to the old men and women who wept openly when the names of the dead were read aloud. The younger generation had their own challenges. The Great War was looming, new technologies were changing the world, and the tornado was a relic of a bygone era. Yet even as they turned their attention to the future, they knew that the storm had shaped them. It had made their parents who they were. It had given them a city that was stronger and more resilient than before. The tornado also found its way into the annals of science. Meteorologists continued to study the event, using it as a case study for understanding the behavior of supercell thunderstorms. In the 193's, a researcher named Charles Mitchell revisited the Louisville tornado, combing through old newspaper accounts and weather records to reconstruct the storm's path in detail. He published a paper that became a foundational text in the field of tornado climatology. His work showed that the tornado had traveled a path of nearly 20 miles, from the southwestern outskirts of the city to the eastern suburbs, with a width that varied from a few hundred yards to nearly a mile. It had been an F4 or F5 tornado with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Mitchell's analysis confirmed what survivors had always known. They had faced one of the most powerful storms ever recorded on the continent. The tornado's place in history was cemented. It was referenced in textbooks, in documentaries, in the occasional novel. It became a footnote in the larger story of American disaster, sitting alongside the Chicago fire of 1871, the Johnstown flood of 1889, and the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. But for the people of Louisville, it was never just a footnote. It was the defining event of their city's past, a wound that never fully healed, a scar that they carried with pride and sorrow. They knew that the tornado had taken lives, but it had also given them something, a sense of identity, a shared history, a proof that they could endure anything. And so the story continued, passed from generation to generation, growing deeper with each telling. The children of the survivors became the elders, and their children in turn became the keepers of the flame. They told the story of the wind that roared like 1,000 locomotives, of the rain that fell in curtains of ice, of the darkness that swallowed the sun. They told of the heroism and the cowardice, the kindness and the cruelty, the chaos and the order that emerged from the wreckage. They told it not because they wanted to dwell on the horror, but because they wanted to remember what it meant to be alive, to be human, to face the impossible and refuse to yield. In the quiet corners of the city, the marks of the storm remained. In Cave Hill Cemetery, the monument stood silent, weathered by a century of rain and snow. The names of the known dead were carved into the stone, but there was a blank section, too, for those who had been buried without identification. Visitors sometimes left coins or flowers. Children would run their fingers over the letters, tracing the date, March 27, 1890. They did not fully understand what had happened there, but they felt the weight of it, the gravity of that day. And so it was in the spring of 2020, 130 years after the storm, a group of historians and community volunteers gathered at the monument. They had spent months researching the lives of the victims, trying to put names to the unmarked graves. They had found records of immigrants, former slaves, laborers, children, all of whom had been lost to the tornado and then lost again to history. They had brought a list of names, and they read them aloud one by one under a clear blue sky. The wind, gentle that day, carried their voices across the cemetery. The dead were no longer anonymous. They were remembered. After the reading, a woman stepped forward, an older woman whose grandmother had been Maggie O'Rourke, the girl with the broken doll. She held a small porcelain figurine in her hand, a new doll, unbroken. She placed it at the base of the monument, next to the flowers. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The gesture was enough. It was a link across the years, a way of saying that the memory had not faded, that the story was still being told. And the story, of course, will never end. As long as there are people in Louisville, as long as the wind blows and the sky darkens with clouds, the memory of that day will live on. It is a part of the city's soul, a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. It is the story of a storm that changed everything, and of the people who refused to be destroyed. It is the story of the Louisville Tornado of 1890. But even as the woman placed that unbroken doll at the monument, the storm had already begun to fade from living memory. The last survivor of the tornado, a woman named Sarah Greer, had died in 1994 at the age of 111. She had been only 4 years old in 1890, but she remembered the sound of the wind and the feeling of her mother's arms around her. She had given interviews to local historians, describing how her family had huddled in a root cellar while their house was torn apart. Her voice, crackling on old cassette tapes, was the final thread connecting the present to that terrible afternoon. When she passed, the tornado became history, not memory. It belonged to books and archives, not to the breath of someone who had been there. Yet the city continued to reckon with the storm in quiet, unexpected ways. In the 1940s, during a renovation of the old city hall, workers discovered a hidden time capsule that had been placed in the cornerstone in 1873. Inside were newspapers, coins, and a letter from the mayor of the time. The letter spoke of Louisville's bright future, its growing industry and prosperous river trade. It made no mention of storms. The irony was not lost on the historians who opened the capsule. The city's optimism, preserved in brass and lead, had been shattered less than 2 decades later. The capsule was put on display in the new city hall, a reminder of the hubris that nature could humble in an instant. The tornado also left its mark on the way Americans thought about the weather. In the decades after the storm, the U.S. Weather Bureau, which had been skeptical about tornado forecasting, began to take the threat more seriously. The Louisville disaster was cited in congressional hearings that led to the expansion of the Bureau's warning system. By the early 20th century, a network of volunteer observers had been established across the Midwest, telegraphing reports of funnel clouds to central offices. It was slow, imperfect, and often too late, but it was a beginning. The tornado that had caught Louisville unprepared had helped push the country toward a system that would one day save millions of lives. In the 1950s, when Doppler radar was still a laboratory experiment, meteorologists looked back at the 1890 storm as a baseline for understanding extreme weather. They used the descriptions from survivors to estimate wind speeds and pressure drops. They correlated the path with modern topographical maps, noting how the tornado had seemed to skip over certain neighborhoods while destroying others. Theories about airflow and atmospheric instability were tested against the data from that single event. The storm became a kind of ghost in the machine of climate science, a reference point for every new model and prediction. Meanwhile, the city itself continued to change. The old industrial heart of Louisville, the breweries and tobacco warehouses that had defined its skyline, slowly gave way to new industries. Healthcare and finance moved in. The waterfront was redeveloped. The Falls City Brewery, which had been the epicenter of the storm's worst destruction, was demolished in the 1970s to make way for a parking lot. A plaque on the wall of a nearby building marked the spot, but most people walked past it without a second glance. The river ale that had flowed through the streets was now just a story, a detail in the grand narrative of the storm. But there were those who insisted on remembering. In 1980, a local historian named Robert G. Calvert published a book titled The Wind That Shook the Falls, a detailed account of the tornado and its aftermath. He had spent years interviewing the children of survivors, combing through church records, and mapping the damage block by block. His book became the definitive history, quoted in every article and documentary that followed. Calvert gave lectures at schools and community centers, always ending with the same message. The tornado is not just a tragedy. It is a lesson in what we are capable of, both the worst and the best. He died in 2003, but his book remained in print, a steady seller in local bookstores. The tornado also found its way into the arts in more subtle ways than the paintings of John Whistler. In the 1990s, a Louisville-based playwright named Diane L. Perkins wrote a one-act play called The Hour Before Dark, which told the story of 3 families in the moments before the storm struck. The play had no tornado on stage. Instead, it focused on the mundane arguments and small kindnesses of ordinary people unaware of what was coming. The final scene showed a child counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, a number that grew smaller and smaller until the lights went out. The play was performed at the Actors Theater of Louisville and received critical acclaim. Reviewers noted that it was not about a historical event at all, but about the fragility of every moment. In 2015, a documentary film titled The Knife of the Wind was released, featuring computer-generated reconstructions of the tornado's path. The filmmakers used historical photographs and weather data to create a minute-by-minute simulation of the storm. The final sequence showed a 3-dimensional map of Louisville as it might have looked on March 27, 1890, with the tornado moving like a dark scar across the city. The documentary aired on PBS and was nominated for an Emmy. It included interviews with meteorologists, historians, and descendants of survivors. One of those descendants was a woman named Eliza Ralston, whose great-grandfather had been a bartender at the Falls City Brewery. She told the camera he never talked about it, but he stopped drinking beer after that day. He said it tasted too sweet, like the air before the storm. The tornado also became a point of pilgrimage for tornado enthusiasts and meteorology students. Every year, a small group of storm chasers would gather in Louisville on March 27th to trace the path of the 1890 tornado. They would drive through the neighborhoods, stopping at churches and parks where the destruction had been heaviest. They would take measurements, photograph the terrain, and discuss the differences between modern building codes and 19th century construction. For them, the storm was a landmark, a benchmark of what a tornado could do. They called it the grandfather of all tornadoes, even though stronger storms had occurred since. It was not the deadliest or the widest, but it was one of the first to be documented in such detail, and that gave it a special place in their lore. Back in the city, the memory of the tornado had become interwoven with the identity of Louisville in ways that were both conscious and unconscious. The city's official seal, adopted in 1892, included a phoenix rising from flames, a symbol of rebirth that many people connected to the post-tornado rebuilding. The phrase resurgence was added to the flag in the early 20th century, a Latin word meaning rising again. Tourists rarely noticed, but locals knew the story. They knew that every brick in the downtown buildings was a testament to the storm. In the schools, children learned about the tornado as part of the Kentucky history curriculum. They did projects, built models, and wrote essays. One year, a third-grade class created a mural showing the tornado as a swirling vortex with faces of survivors peering out from the debris. The mural hung in the hallway of the Jefferson County Public School headquarters until it was replaced by a new one in 2010. The old mural was stored in a basement, where it eventually crumbled from moisture and neglect. But the memory it represented did not crumble. It was passed on in the stories the children told their own children decades later. And those stories in turn shaped the way Louisville responded to later disasters. When a severe ice storm struck the region in 2009, power was out for weeks and the city was paralyzed. But the response was swift and organized. Shelters were set up in churches, neighbors checked on the elderly, and volunteers cleared fallen trees with handsaws and chainsaws. The mayor at the time, Jerry Abramson, gave a speech in which he referenced the tornado of 1890. "Our ancestors faced something far worse and rebuilt," he said. "We can do the same." The speech was widely praised not for its eloquence but for its honesty. The tornado was no longer a wound, it was a foundation. In the 21st century, the tornado even entered the realm of digital commemoration. A website called the Louisville Tornado Project was launched in 2015, featuring interactive maps, digitized newspaper articles, and oral histories. Users could click on a street address and see what had stood there in 1890 and whether it had survived the storm. The site also included a forum where descendants could share family stories and photographs. One user posted a letter from her great-grandmother, written the day after the tornado. The letter described the smell of wet ash and the sound of crying in the night. It was short, barely a page, but it had been saved for more than a century. Others shared similar treasures: a twisted piece of metal that had been a bed frame, a photograph of a house with the roof collapsed, a wedding ring found in the rubble 3 weeks after the storm. Through all of this, the monument in Cave Hill Cemetery remained the physical heart of remembrance. In 2017, a group of volunteers raised funds to restore it. The stone had cracked from years of freeze-thaw cycles, and the names were becoming hard to read. A stone mason spent 2 months carefully repairing the damage, using techniques that matched the original carving. When the work was finished, a rededication ceremony was held. Hundreds of people attended, many of them wearing period clothing to evoke the 1890s. A local historian read the names of the dead, and a bell was tolled once for each name. The ceremony ended with the release of white doves, which circled the cemetery and then flew toward the city. It was a beautiful gesture, but beneath it was the same old truth: the dead were gone and the living could only honor them. So the story continues, even as the city grows and changes. The skyline of Louisville is now dominated by the glass and steel towers of hospitals and banks, not the wooden structures of the 19th century. The riverfront is lined with parks and condominiums, not breweries and warehouses. The people who live there now are mostly transplants drawn by jobs or family, and they may never have heard the story of the tornado, but the city itself remembers. The layout of the streets, the strength of the buildings, the spirit of the people, all of it bears the imprint of that single day. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the Louisville Tornado of 1890. Not the photographs or the monuments or the books, but the quiet, unspoken resilience that runs through the city like a deep river. It is the knowledge that no matter how dark the sky gets, no matter how loud the wind, there is always a morning after. There is always someone who will pick up a broken doll and carry it home. There is always someone who will place a wreath where the brewery stood, and remember, the years will continue to pass. The monument will weather and crack again, and new names will be added to the blank section as historians uncover more records. The descendants of the survivors will grow old and die, and their children will remember only the stories their grandparents told. And those stories will change, growing softer around the edges, losing the sharpness of the original pain. But the core of the story will remain. A city faced the impossible and refused to be destroyed. And so, on a warm spring afternoon in some far-off future, a child might ask their parent what happened on that day long ago. And the parent, perhaps having read this very account, will pause. They will look out the window at the clear blue sky, and they will tell the child about the wind that came from nowhere, the beer that ran in the streets, the mother who held her child through the darkness. They will tell them about the heroism and the sorrow, the destruction and the rebirth. And when the story ends, the child will look at the clouds with new eyes, understanding that the world is both fragile and strong, and that the people of Louisville, like people everywhere, carry within them the power to rise from the rubble and begin again. That is the story. That is the memory. And as long as there is a voice to tell it, the Louisville Tornado of 1890 will never truly pass. It will live on not as a day of horror, but as a day of awakening, a day when a city learned what it was made of and found itself unbroken. And so, in the quiet corners of Louisville, the story continues to breathe. There is a woman named Evelyn, now in her late 80s, who lives in the same house her great-grandmother built after the tornado. The house is a modest bungalow on a tree-lined street, but Evelyn knows every creak and every beam. Her great-grandmother was a widow when the storm hit, and she lost everything: her husband, her home, her livelihood. But she did not give up. She took a job at a local boarding house, saved every penny, and within 5 years she had bought a small lot and hired a carpenter to build a new home. The house was finished in 1896, and the family has lived there ever since. Evelyn grew up hearing the story at the dinner table, and now she tells it to her grandchildren. She shows them the old photographs, the brown and white images of a city in ruins, and then she points to the window and says, "Look out there, that's what we built, and we built it together." In the public library, a special collection holds the diaries of a young schoolteacher named Margaret, who wrote about the tornado in 1890. Margaret was 24 at the time, and she recorded not just the destruction but the small acts of kindness that followed. One entry dated March 28 reads, "I saw a man carrying a child on his shoulders, the child clinging to his neck. The man had lost his own family, but he carried that child for 3 blocks until he found a place of safety. I do not know his name, I will never forget his face." Margaret's diaries were discovered in an attic in 1975 and donated to the library. They are now digitized, and every year on the anniversary of the storm, the library hosts a reading where volunteers recite selected passages. The reading is always well attended, and the audience sits in silence, listening to the words of a woman who lived through it, who wrote with a pen dipped in ink and tears. There is also the story of the bells. In the days after the tornado, the church bells of Louisville fell silent. Many of the churches had been damaged and the bell towers were unstable. But on the first Sunday after the storm, a single bell rang out from St. Mary's Cathedral, which had suffered only minor damage. The bell tolled for 5 minutes, a call to worship and a call to hope. The sound carried across the city and people stopped in the streets to listen. It was a signal that the city was still alive. Today, a tradition has been revived. Every year on March 27th at precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, the bells of every church in Louisville ring for 1 minute. The sound is not mournful, it is defiant. It says, "We are still here, we will always be here." The downtown area, which was rebuilt so quickly in the 1890s, still bears the marks of that era. The buildings along Main Street are mostly brick and stone, with ornate cornices and arched windows. They were constructed with a sturdiness that modern skyscrapers lack, and many of them have survived not only the tornado but the floods of 1937 and the urban renewal of the 1960s. In the lobby of one such building, a plaque commemorates the storm. The plaque is small, easy to miss, but those who notice it often stop to read the inscription. "In memory of the 102 souls lost on March 27, 1890. This building was raised from the ashes. Let it stand as a symbol of our resolve." The plaque was placed there in 1892 and it has never been removed. It is a quiet reminder, a stone sentinel watching over the bustle of modern commerce. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the tornado is the way it changed the city's understanding of itself. Before 1890, Louisville was a confident, even boastful city, proud of its commerce and its culture. The tornado humbled it. It taught the city that its strength was not in its buildings or its wealth, but in its people and their willingness to help each other. That lesson has been passed down through generations, and it surfaces in times of crisis. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, Louisville was hit hard. But the response was different from other cities. Neighbors organized food deliveries, volunteers sewed masks, and community centers became vaccination sites. The mayor at the time, Greg Fisher, often spoke about the tornado in his daily briefings. He would say, "We have been through worse. We know how to do this. We are Louisville." The story of the tornado also found its way into the arts. In 2019, a local playwright named Angela Thomas wrote a play called The Beer That Saved the City, a dark comedy that explored the aftermath of the storm through the eyes of a fictional brewer's family. The play was a hit, running for 6 months at the Kentucky Center for the Performing Arts. It mixed tragedy with humor, showing how the survivors used gallows humor to cope with their loss. One scene depicted a woman sweeping rubble from her front porch while singing a drinking song. The audience laughed and cried in equal measure. The play was not a historical reenactment but a meditation on resilience, and it resonated deeply with modern audiences who understood that the same spirit was still alive. The natural world, too, has its own memory of the tornado. The path of the storm, now a swath of redeveloped land, is still visible in the soil. Geologists have studied the tree rings in Cave Hill Cemetery, and they found that the trees that survived the tornado grew wider rings in the years after, as if they were compensating for the trauma. Those trees are now over 100 years old, and they stand as living witnesses. In the spring, when the dogwoods bloom, the cemetery is covered in white and pink blossoms. The monument to the unknown dead is often surrounded by flowers left by visitors who come to pay their respects. Some of the flowers are store-bought, others are wildflowers picked from the side of the road. It does not matter, the gesture is the same, and so the story of the Louisville Tornado of 1890 is not really about a storm. It is about a city that refused to be defined by its worst day. It is about the people who picked up the pieces and built something better. It is about the mothers and fathers who told their children, "We survived, and so will you." It is about the quiet heroism that never makes the headlines but is the true fabric of a community. The storm is long gone, but its echo is still heard in the laughter of children playing in the park, in the clink of glasses at a downtown bar, in the hum of traffic on I-6. Louisville is a city of stories, and this one is the deepest, the oldest, the one that binds them all together. So if you ever find yourself walking along the streets of Louisville, take a moment to look up at the old buildings, to read the plaques, to listen to the bells. And if you meet an old man sitting on a bench outside the Seelbach Hotel, he might tell you the story. He might lean forward, his eyes narrowing, and say, "I wasn't there, of course, but my grandfather was. He was a boy of 10, and he remembered the smell of beer and the sound of crying. He never forgot." And then he will look at you, and you will see the ghost of the storm in his gaze. But you will also see the fire of a city that has always known how to rise. And you will understand that some stories never end. They just keep being told over and over until they become part of the air you breathe, part of the ground you walk on, part of the heart you carry. And that is how the Louisville Tornado of 1890 survives. Not in the record books, not in the museum displays, but in the living, breathing memory of a people who have made their home on the banks of the Ohio and who will not be swept away.